My boyfriend was recording us without my knowledge and posting the videos online to make money. His entire family knew, except me. My name is Riley, and I need to tell you what happened to me because honestly, I still can't quite believe it myself. This is going to be long and messy, and probably hard to read in places, but I need to get it out there. So, context. I'd been dating this guy for 4 years. 4 whole years. We met at a mutual friend's party, hit it off immediately, moved in together after 18 months. The relationship was good, or at least I thought it was. Sure, he could be controlling sometimes, but I chalked it up to him caring about me. Looking back now, I see how naive that sounds. The thing is, in all those 4 years, I'd never met his family. Not once. He always had excuses. They lived far away, they were busy, the timing wasn't right. I'll admit it bothered me, but I didn't push too hard. Maybe I should have. That's hindsight for you. Then last month, he finally invited me to their annual summer barbecue. I was nervous but excited, you know? Finally getting to meet the people who raised the man I loved. I bought a nice dress, brought homemade potato salad, the whole 9 yards. The barbecue was at his parents' house, this big property with a huge backyard. When we arrived, the atmosphere felt off immediately. His mom barely looked at me. His dad shook my hand but wouldn't meet my eyes. His sister kept glancing at me with this expression I couldn't read. Pity, maybe? His younger brother was the only one who seemed remotely normal, though even he seemed tense. I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were just awkward with new people. Maybe I was overthinking. But as the afternoon wore on, the weird vibes intensified. Conversations would stop when I walked up. People whispered. His mom pulled him aside 3 separate times for hushed discussions. Then his brother, the younger one, disappeared into the house. He came back out holding a laptop, and the look on his face made my stomach drop. He walked straight up to me and his brother, opened the laptop, and turned it toward us without saying a word. What I saw on that screen shattered my entire world. Videos of me. Intimate videos. Videos that should have been private, that I'd never agreed to be filmed. But there they were, uploaded to various websites with disgusting titles that made me want to vomit. My face was clearly visible. My body on display for strangers. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The laptop slipped from his brother's hands onto the table as I stared. Frozen. Around me, his family erupted. His mother started screaming at his brother for showing me. His father was yelling at everyone to calm down. His sister looked like she was going to cry, and my boyfriend? He went pale but not surprised. Not shocked. Just caught. That's when his brother played the audio recordings. Recordings of my boyfriend talking to someone, laughing about how easy it was to position cameras, how I never noticed anything, bragging about the money he was making from subscriptions, discussing which angles got the most views. My humiliation was his side hustle. The family knew. They all knew. His mother was screaming about how they'd planned to set me up with his cousin instead, to fix the situation without me finding out. His father kept saying they were trying to protect the family's reputation. His sister admitted they'd been arguing about telling me for months. I don't remember much after that. I know I stood up. I know I grabbed my purse. I think I said something, but I couldn't tell you what. His brother pressed a USB drive into my hand and whispered that he was sorry, that he couldn't let it continue. Then I was in my car driving, not even knowing where I was going. I ended up at some cheap motel on the highway, paid for 3 nights in cash, and locked myself in the room. That's where I am now, writing this at 2 in the morning because sleep is impossible. The USB drive is sitting on the nightstand, and I haven't looked at it yet. I'm terrified of what else might be on there. Tomorrow, I need to figure out what to do. But tonight, I'm just trying to process the fact that the man I loved, the man I trusted completely, had been violating me in the worst possible way for who knows how long. And his entire family knew and did nothing. I keep thinking about all the times he insisted on certain gifts. A teddy bear for my birthday, a digital clock for the bedroom, a jewelry box for the dresser. Were those all cameras? How long has this been going on? How many people have seen those videos? Nausea washes over me. The violation is complete. The stupidity of not seeing it sooner burns. And terror about what comes next threatens to overwhelm me. But underneath it all, anger simmers. And that anger is the only thing keeping me together right now. Walking into the police station was one of the hardest things I've ever done. My friend came with me, held my hand in the waiting room while I filled out the initial forms. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely write. They assigned me to a detective who specialized in cyber crimes and sexual offenses. His name doesn't matter, but his demeanor did. He was professional, respectful, and genuinely seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened. That helped more than I expected. He took me into a private interview room and let me tell the whole story from beginning to end. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush me, just let me talk. When I got to the part about the videos, he gently asked if I had documentation. I showed him the USB drive and the screenshots his brother had helped me compile. The detective explained the potential criminal charges: invasion of privacy, distribution of intimate images without consent, possibly harassment and stalking depending on what else they found. He said the evidence I'd brought was substantial and gave them a strong foundation for the case. He asked if I wanted to pursue a restraining order. I said yes immediately. He explained the process, helped me understand what protections I'd have, what violations would mean. He said he'd help me file the petition that afternoon. Then came the harder questions. He needed to know about our relationship, our living situation, our sexual history. He assured me it was relevant to the case, to establish consent and violation. I get why he had to ask, but it still felt invasive, like I was being examined under a microscope. He photographed all my evidence and gave me a case number, said he'd start the investigation immediately, that they'd need to obtain search warrants for his electronics and online accounts. Asked if I could provide a list of his devices, his usual passwords, anything that might help. I told him about the gifts, the teddy bear, the clock, the jewelry box. His expression darkened. He said they'd need to seize those items for evidence. It dawned on me they were still at the apartment, and the thought of going back there made my stomach turn. The detective said I wouldn't have to go back. They could arrange to collect the items with a warrant. That was a relief I can't even describe. Before I left, he gave me his direct number and told me to call if I remembered anything else or if I felt unsafe. He said I should document any contact attempts, any threats, anything that felt like harassment. He also gave me a list of victim advocates and counseling services. The restraining order petition took another 2 hours. More forms, more statements, more reliving of what happened. By the time we finished, I was emotionally exhausted, but I had a temporary emergency order in place, effective immediately. He wasn't allowed to contact me, come near me, or share any more content. My friend took me to lunch afterward, tried to get me to eat something. I managed half a sandwich. She kept saying how proud she was of me for doing this, for not backing down. I appreciated it, but mostly I just felt numb. That evening, I started looking into lawyers. The detective had recommended several who specialized in cases like mine. I sent consultation requests to 3 of them, explaining the situation briefly. 2 responded within hours, offering to meet that week. I also scheduled my first therapy appointment. The crisis counselor had emphasized how important that would be, and honestly, I knew I needed it. The trauma specialist I found had availability in 3 days. His brother texted asking if I'd gone to the police. When I said yes, he replied that it was the right thing to do. He said his brother had been served with the restraining order at work that afternoon and had completely lost it. Started yelling at the officers in front of his coworkers. Part of me felt satisfied hearing that. Part of me felt sad that it had come to this. But mostly, determination steadied me. This was just the beginning, and I knew the road ahead would be brutal. But I'd taken the first real steps toward justice, toward reclaiming some control over my own story. That night, my friend made dinner and we watched mindless television. She didn't try to make me talk about it, didn't push for details. She just existed in the same space, a steady presence that reminded me I wasn't alone. Before bed, I got an email from the content removal specialist the crisis counselor had mentioned. She explained her process, her success rate, how long it typically took. She said she'd start working on it immediately if I wanted to proceed. I replied yes within minutes. As I lay in the guest bed that night, I thought about the detective's words. "This wasn't your fault," he'd said. "What he did was a crime. And you're the victim here. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." I repeated those words to myself until I finally fell asleep. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more difficult conversations. But I'd survive today. That had to count for something. My friend sat me down 3 days after I filed the police report and said I couldn't keep living out of her guest room. Not because she wanted me gone, but because she wanted me to feel settled. She offered to help me look for apartments, but then she suggested something else. What if I just moved in properly? She had the space, she lived alone, And honestly, she'd feel better knowing I wasn't isolated. My first therapy session was that same week. The therapist specialized in trauma and sexual violence, and from the moment I walked into her office, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. She didn't make me tell the whole story right away. Instead, we talked about what I was feeling in the present moment, what I needed to feel safe. She taught me grounding techniques for when the anxiety got too overwhelming. She explained what trauma responses looked like, why I might be having trouble sleeping or eating or concentrating. Just knowing there were reasons for what I was experiencing, that I wasn't losing my mind, helped immensely. We created a safety plan together. What to do if I saw him in public, who to call if I felt unsafe, how to handle panic attacks. It sounds paranoid, maybe, but having that structure gave me a sense of control I'd been missing. Work had been texting, asking when I'd be back. I'd called in sick for almost a week, which wasn't like me. I finally called my boss and asked if we could meet in person. I didn't want to, but I needed to explain what was happening, at least partially. He met me at a coffee shop near the office. I gave him the basics. Relationship ended badly, legal situation ongoing. I was safe but needed some time. He didn't press for details, just asked what I needed. I told him I couldn't come into the office yet, that I was scared of running into him since we'd occasionally met there for lunch. My boss offered remote work immediately, said I could keep my hours flexible, that the most important thing was that I felt safe. He'd clear it with management. I nearly broke down right there in the coffee shop. Kindness, when you're expecting judgment, hits differently. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week. The detective called to update me on the investigation. They'd executed the search warrant on the apartment and his work locker. Found 3 hidden cameras exactly where I'd suspected, in the teddy bear, the clock, and the jewelry box. They'd also seized his computer, phone, and several external hard drives. The preliminary analysis showed hundreds of files. Not just videos of me, but photos too. Some going back almost 2 years. There were also files from before we dated, videos of women I didn't recognize. The case was expanding beyond just what he'd done to me. That information messed me up for a couple of days. The idea that I wasn't the only victim, that he'd done this before, that he'd probably do it again if not stopped. It made everything feel even more urgent, more necessary. The content removal specialist sent her first progress report. She'd successfully requested takedowns on 12 platforms so far. The videos were being removed, though she warned some might resurface on other sites. She was monitoring multiple platforms and would continue the process for as long as needed. Knowing the videos were being taken down, one by one, felt like slowly reclaiming pieces of myself. It wasn't fast enough, would never be fast enough, but it was something. His brother checked in regularly. He'd been completely ostracized by their parents for betraying the family. His sister was in therapy now, too, processing her own guilt about not speaking up sooner. Their dad had apparently hired a lawyer for his brother, was planning to fight the charges. His mother was telling anyone who would listen that I was vindictive and overreacting. The betrayal from his family, from people I'd been hoping to build relationships with, stung in a different way. But I tried not to dwell on it. They'd made their choices, just like I was making mine. My second therapy session focused on processing the violation. The therapist helped me understand that what I was feeling, the disgust, the shame, the anger, was all normal and valid. She reminded me that shame belonged to him, not to me. I intellectually understood that, but emotionally, I was still working through it. She also suggested I might want to join a support group for survivors of image-based abuse. I wasn't ready for that yet, but I kept the information for when I was. 2 weeks after everything exploded, I was sitting in my friend's living room eating dinner like a normal person, when I realized something. I'd gotten through 2 whole weeks. I'd filed reports, started therapy, secured housing, kept my job, and taken active steps toward healing. The trauma was still there. The violation still happened. But I was fighting back, and that mattered. I was building a foundation to stand on, piece by piece. It was slow, exhausting work, but it was work I was determined to see through. 3 weeks into this nightmare, his father showed up at my friend's apartment. I don't know how he found the address, but there he was, standing in the hallway looking uncomfortable and tired. My friend answered the door and immediately tried to close it. But he asked to speak with me, said it was important. Against my better judgment, I agreed. But we talked in the hallway with my friend standing right there, door open, ready to intervene if needed. He handed me an old laptop. Said it was one his son had used in college, that he'd found it in their storage. Said he thought there might be more evidence on it and that I should have it. His hands were shaking when he gave it to me. I asked why he was doing this. Why now? He just said he couldn't protect his son from his own actions anymore, that what he'd done was unforgivable. Then he left before I could respond. I called the detective immediately. He came to pick up the laptop that afternoon and said he'd add it to the evidence they were processing. His face when he took it told me he suspected what we'd find on it. 2 days later, the detective called. The laptop was a goldmine of evidence. There were folders meticulously organized by year, by victim. There were chat logs discussing techniques with other users. There were deleted files they'd recovered. Most damning, there was a camera hidden inside the laptop itself, positioned to record without any visible indication. I'd borrowed that laptop once, maybe 8 months ago when mine was being repaired. I'd used it in the bedroom. The thought made my skin crawl. But here's where things got worse. While examining the laptop, they discovered evidence of cameras in other locations. Not just the apartment, but in his car, in his office, even in public restrooms where he'd allegedly placed temporary devices. The detective said they'd identified at least 7 other women in the files, 7 other women who'd been recorded without their knowledge or consent. They were in the process of tracking them down to notify them. Sickness churned in my stomach. Rage built inside me, but mostly overwhelming responsibility weighed on me. If I hadn't pursued this, if I'd just let it go like his family wanted, these other women might never have known. They'd be out there living their lives while strangers watched their most private moments. The restraining order hearing finally happened. He showed up with his lawyer, looking nothing like the man I'd loved. He looked smaller somehow, cornered. His lawyer argued that I was exaggerating, that it was a misunderstanding, that no crime had been committed. The judge reviewed the evidence, the videos, the chat logs, the search warrant results. The look on her face was pure disgust. She granted the permanent restraining order for 1 full year with the possibility of extension. He was to stay at least 300 feet away from me at all times. No contact, direct or indirect. Violation would result in immediate arrest. His lawyer tried to object. The judge shut him down so fast I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Walking out of that courtroom with a year-long protection order felt like a victory, even though I knew it was just paper. Paper doesn't stop determined people. But it was documentation, proof that the legal system recognized the threat he posed. The detective mentioned they were building the case toward multiple felony charges. The more evidence they processed, the stronger the case became. He said the prosecutor was very interested in pursuing this aggressively, especially given the number of victims involved. One of the other women they'd contacted reached out to me through the detective. She asked if we could talk. I said yes. We met at a coffee shop the next day. She was older than me, maybe late 30s. She'd dated him 5 years ago before me. The relationship ended badly, and she never knew why he'd insisted on certain gifts, certain decorations in her apartment. Now she knew. We talked for 3 hours, shared our experiences, our trauma, our anger. She'd already started therapy, had already contacted a lawyer. She was planning to file her own report, add her voice to the growing list of evidence against him. Knowing I wasn't alone, that there were other women fighting alongside me, made the burden feel slightly lighter. We exchanged numbers, promised to keep each other updated. The forensic analysis of all the seized devices finally came back complete. The detective said there were over 400 files spanning 5 years. Not just bedroom recordings, but videos taken in public places, in bathrooms, in changing rooms. Evidence of illegal surveillance on a massive scale. He'd been selling subscriptions to private content. He'd been trading files with other users. He'd been running an entire operation built on violating women's privacy and dignity. I asked the detective how someone does that, how someone looks at the people they claim to love and sees only content to monetize. He said predators don't think like normal people, that I'd never understand the mindset because I wasn't wired that way. That was probably for the best. That night, I lay awake thinking about all those files, all those women, all those violations. I thought about how easily it could have continued if his brother hadn't found that folder, if his conscience hadn't won out over family loyalty. I thought about the laptop his father brought me, the risk he took to do the right thing even if it meant implicating his own son further. These small acts of courage, these moments where people chose truth over comfort, had made all the difference. The case was bigger than I'd ever imagined. The consequences would be more severe than I'd hoped. And somewhere in all of that, there was justice waiting to be served. The restraining order should have made me feel safer. Instead, it seemed to make his family more desperate. His mother started calling from different numbers. I'd block one, another would pop up the next day. She never left threatening messages, nothing that would violate the order directly, but the content was always the same. I was destroying a good man over a misunderstanding. I should think about his future. Couldn't we resolve this privately? After the sixth call from a sixth different number, I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize entirely. Let them go to voicemail, document everything. That's what the detective had said. But his mother got creative. She started showing up places. The coffee shop near my friend's apartment where I'd go to work remotely. The grocery store I frequented. Never approaching directly, never violating the restraining order that covered him but not her, just watching from a distance. Making her presence known. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. I started having panic attacks in public spaces, constantly looking over my shoulder, second-guessing every outing. My therapist said it was a common tactic used by families of abusers. Make the victim feel unsafe, isolated, convince them the legal process is worse than just dropping everything. The breaking point came when she showed up at my workplace. I'd gone into the office for a meeting I couldn't avoid. Had been there maybe 30 minutes when the receptionist called my extension. Said there was a woman in the lobby asking to see me, claimed to be family. I looked out the window and there she was, sitting in the lobby like she had every right to be there. My boss saw my face and immediately called security. They escorted her out, but not before she'd made a scene, insisting I was keeping her from her son, that I was tearing their family apart. My boss suggested I continue working remotely indefinitely. Said my safety was more important than any meeting. I was grateful but also furious that she'd invaded even that space. That nowhere felt truly safe anymore. I reported the workplace incident to the detective. He said they'd document it, that if it continued we could pursue harassment charges against her separately. He also suggested I might want to consider a security system for my friend's apartment, maybe even a personal alarm. The fact that these felt like reasonable suggestions showed how far things had spiraled. Then the messages started appearing on my social media. I'd made everything private, blocked everyone connected to him, but anonymous accounts kept popping up. Not threats, nothing overtly illegal. Just nasty comments on old photos. Messages about how I'd regret my choices. Vague warnings about karma. I screenshot everything, sent it all to the detective, then deactivated all my accounts. It felt like giving up a piece of my life, but the mental health cost of maintaining them wasn't worth it. The worst violation came when I found out he'd violated the restraining order directly. He'd created fake social media accounts to message me, thinking I wouldn't figure out it was him. But his writing style was distinctive, and he made the mistake of referencing things only he would know. The messages were bizarre. Apologizing one moment, threatening the next, begging me to drop the charges, then calling me terrible names. It was clear he was unraveling, and that scared me more than the harassment from his family did. I forwarded everything to the detective. Within hours, they'd traced the accounts back to his IP address. He'd been stupid enough to use his home internet. The detective said they'd be bringing him in for violating the restraining order, that he'd face additional charges. He was arrested at work the next day. His brother told me about it later, how he'd been escorted out in handcuffs in front of all his co-workers, how he'd lost his job immediately, how he'd spent the night in jail before his parents bailed him out. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt scared that this would make him more dangerous. My therapist said both reactions were valid and normal. The judge was not pleased about the restraining order violation. At the emergency hearing, she increased the restrictions. Now he had to wear a GPS monitor. If he came within 500 feet of me, the police would be notified automatically. He was ordered to surrender his passport, and the violation would be factored into his eventual sentencing. His lawyer tried to argue that the messages weren't threatening, that his client was just trying to apologize. The judge asked if the lawyer understood what no contact meant, then suggested he review the order more carefully before his next court appearance. Walking out of that hearing, something shifted inside me. They'd pushed and pushed, tried to intimidate me into backing down, and instead they'd made everything worse for him. Every harassment attempt, every restraining order violation, Every attempt to make me feel small just added to the mountain of evidence against him. His brother called that night, said his parents were finally starting to understand the severity of what their son had done, that the lawyer had basically told them there was no avoiding prison time at this point. His mother was apparently having a breakdown, couldn't accept that her precious boy was looking at multiple felonies. I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. She'd had so many chances to do the right thing, and instead she'd chosen to harass me, to protect a predator, to prioritize her own comfort over justice. These were consequences of her choices just as much as his. My friend made dinner that night, my favorite pasta dish. We ate in relative silence, but it was a comfortable silence. She didn't need me to talk about it. She just needed me to know I wasn't facing this alone. The harassment hadn't stopped. The legal battle was far from over, but I was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to be the victim they wanted me to be. And that had to count for something. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the initial police report. 6 weeks of therapy, of documenting harassment, of trying to rebuild some semblance of normal life while knowing this day was coming. My victim advocate met with me the day before to prepare. She explained what would happen, who would be there, what I should expect. She said I'd have the opportunity to give a victim impact statement if I wanted to. I did. I'd been writing and rewriting it for weeks. The morning of the hearing, I put on the most professional outfit I owned and tried to project confidence I didn't feel. My friend came with me, sat in the back of the courtroom for moral support. The victim advocate sat beside me at the prosecution table. He was already there when I arrived, sitting with his lawyer and his parents. He wouldn't look at me. His mother glared daggers, but I'd learned to ignore her. His father stared at his hands like he wished he could disappear. The prosecutor was a woman in her mid-40s who'd specialized in sexual crimes for over a decade. She'd met with me twice before, explained the process, asked detailed questions about the relationship and the abuse. She was professional, thorough, and clearly took this case seriously. The hearing began with the prosecution presenting their evidence. They showed the videos, though thankfully not in full, just enough to establish that they existed and what they contained. They presented the chat logs, the financial records showing the money he'd made, the forensic analysis of his devices. Then came the recordings. The audio his brother had captured of him discussing the cameras, laughing about how clueless I was, bragging about his subscriber count. Hearing his voice like that, cold and calculating, describing our intimate moments as content and product, made me physically ill. The prosecutor called the forensic analyst who'd examined his devices. He testified about the scope of the operation, over 400 files, 7 identified victims so far, evidence of trading content with similar offenders online. He described the hidden cameras, the sophisticated setup, the lengths he'd gone to avoid detection. Then it was my turn to give my statement. I walked to the podium on shaking legs and read from the paper I'd prepared. I described the betrayal, the violation, the way he'd manipulated my trust. I talked about the fear I lived with daily, the therapy I needed, the damage to my sense of safety and autonomy. I described finding out that intimate moments I'd treasured had been performance for strangers, that gifts I'd loved had been surveillance devices, that the man I'd trusted with my heart and body had been profiting from my humiliation for years. My voice broke more than once, but I got through it. When I finished and looked up, several people in the courtroom were crying. The judge's expression was grim. The defense attorney tried to paint him as remorseful, as someone who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to have his life ruined. He argued that the videos weren't technically illegal since they'd been filmed in a shared residence, that the relationship had been consensual, that intent mattered. The prosecutor demolished that argument efficiently. She cited specific statutes about consent to recording, about distribution of intimate images, about reasonable expectation of privacy. She pointed out that several videos were taken in public restrooms and other locations where surveillance was undeniably illegal. Then, his sister took the stand. I hadn't known she was testifying. She looked terrible, exhausted, older than her 28 years. She described the family meeting where they'd discovered what he'd been doing, how their parents had immediately started planning damage control instead of insisting he stop, how she'd begged them to tell me to do the right thing but had been overruled. She apologized directly to me from the witness stand, said she'd been a coward, that she should have told me immediately, that her silence had enabled the abuse to continue. Her testimony was damning for him and his parents. The defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting she had ulterior motives for turning against her brother. She looked at him with such sadness and said, "My motive is that I couldn't live with myself anymore knowing what I knew and doing nothing." The judge called a brief recess. I stepped outside with my friend and the victim advocate. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The advocate said I'd done beautifully, that my statement was powerful and would definitely impact the proceedings. When we returned, the judge delivered her ruling. She found probable cause for all charges: invasion of privacy, distribution of intimate images without consent, illegal surveillance, harassment, and violation of the restraining order. The case would proceed to the next phase. She maintained all existing orders and added that he was not to contact any of the other identified victims either. His bail was increased significantly. The judge said, given the restraining order violations and the severity of the charges, she was concerned about him being a danger to the community. His parents' faces went white when they heard the new amount. The prosecutor explained afterward that this was a strong outcome. The judge had essentially greenlit the prosecution, found the evidence compelling, and indicated she was taking this seriously. We'd move next to negotiations or trial preparation, depending on what the defense wanted to do. Walking out of that courthouse, exhaustion and relief warred within me. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But it was progress. Real, tangible progress toward justice. His brother was waiting outside. He hugged me briefly, told me I'd been incredibly brave in there. Said his sister was planning to cut contact with their parents entirely, that she couldn't forgive their role in all this. I told him I understood. That night, my therapist had an emergency session available. We processed the day, the testimony, the weight of having to relive it all in that courtroom. She reminded me that every difficult step brought me closer to closure, to reclaiming my narrative. I believed her. Or at least I was trying to. 2 weeks after the preliminary hearing the prosecutor called, she said the defense had reached out about a potential plea agreement. They knew the evidence was overwhelming, that going to trial would likely result in even harsher sentencing. They wanted to negotiate. Part of me wanted to say no immediately, to make him face a jury, to make him sit through a full trial where every detail would be exposed. But the prosecutor gently reminded me what a trial would mean. Months of additional stress. Having to testify in detail, cross-examination from his lawyer, the possibility of the videos being shown more extensively. She said she'd never pressure me either way, that it was ultimately my decision whether to accept any agreement. But she wanted me to understand the full picture before deciding. The proposed plea deal was this. He'd plead guilty to multiple counts of invasion of privacy and distribution of intimate images without consent. In exchange, they'd drop some of the lesser charges. Sentencing would include 5 years probation with intensive supervision, mandatory registration as a sex offender, mandatory therapy, and restitution to all victims. The prison time would be suspended as long as he completed probation successfully. If he violated even once, he'd serve the full sentence, up to 3 years. The sex offender registration would be permanent. I asked if that was enough, if that was justice for what he'd done. The prosecutor said she understood my anger, that she shared it. But she also explained that trials were unpredictable, that juries sometimes didn't understand the full impact of these crimes, that accepting the plea guaranteed at least this level of accountability. She gave me time to think about it. Said I should consult with my therapist, my advocate, anyone whose opinion I trusted. That I shouldn't rush the decision. I spent the next week agonizing over it. My therapist helped me work through the pros and cons. The certainty of a conviction versus the possibility of a worse outcome at trial. My mental health needs versus my desire for justice. The impact of months more legal proceedings on my healing process. The victim advocate pointed out that the restitution and sex offender registration were significant. He'd never be able to work with children, would have to disclose his status when applying for housing or jobs, would be subject to periodic checks by law enforcement for the rest of his life. The consequences would follow him forever. My friend, always practical, asked what I needed to move forward with my life. Continued legal battles or closure? There was no wrong answer, she emphasized, but it was worth considering. I talked to the other women who'd been victims. 3 of them had been located and notified by this point. 2 were supportive of whatever I decided. Said they trusted my judgment since I'd been most directly involved in the prosecution. The 3rd wanted him in prison, wanted the maximum possible punishment. I understood her position. Some days I felt the same way, but other days I was just exhausted and wanted it over. The prosecutor called again to clarify details. The restitution would be split among all victims, about criminal restitution split among all victims. I could still pursue civil damages separately if I wanted, and the criminal conviction would make that case much stronger. I met with a civil attorney to discuss that option. She explained I could sue for emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and various other damages. With his criminal conviction, she said we'd have a strong case. Recovery might be limited by his actual assets, but the judgment would stand regardless. That conversation changed my perspective somewhat. The criminal case would establish his guilt definitively, but the civil case would allow me to seek additional compensation, to hold him financially accountable beyond the criminal restitution. I called the prosecutor back and said I'd accept the plea deal under certain conditions. I wanted a say in the terms of his probation. I wanted internet monitoring to ensure he wasn't accessing or creating similar content. I wanted him prohibited from possessing any recording devices beyond a basic phone. I wanted therapy specifically focused on his offending behavior. She said she'd negotiate those terms. 2 days later, she called back. The defense had agreed to almost everything. The plea agreement was being drafted. The formal plea hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, I filed the civil lawsuit. The attorney said it would proceed in parallel with the criminal case resolution. His parents' lawyer reached out about settling the civil case before it progressed. They offered a settlement amount if I'd sign an NDA and agree not to discuss the case publicly. I refused immediately. The money meant nothing compared to my right to tell my own story. We countered with payment over 3 years. No NDA, a formal written apology acknowledging the harm caused, and an agreement that neither he nor his family would profit from the story in any way. No book deals, no interviews, no monetization of my trauma. After some back and forth, they agreed. The civil settlement would be finalized after the criminal plea. My therapist said I should be proud of myself for negotiating terms that prioritized my long-term well-being over short-term satisfaction. That choosing a guaranteed outcome over the uncertainty of trial showed strength, not weakness. I wasn't entirely sure I agreed, but I appreciated her perspective. The plea hearing was approaching, and I needed to prepare another statement. This one would be about the impact of his crimes and what I thought appropriate sentencing should include. The content removal specialist sent an update. She'd successfully removed 212 videos and images so far from various platforms. More kept appearing on smaller sites, but she was monitoring and submitting takedown requests continuously. It was like fighting a hydra, but she was making progress. Knowing that fewer people could access those videos, that my intimate moments were being slowly scrubbed from public view, felt like reclaiming small pieces of myself. The night before the plea hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how this would change things, how having his admission of guilt on record would feel, how seeing him forced to acknowledge what he'd done might bring some form of closure. Or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe nothing would ever truly close this chapter. But at least it would turn the page, allow me to start writing the next part of my story. And that had to be enough. The sentencing hearing felt surreal. After 8 weeks of legal proceedings, evidence gathering, and negotiations, it was actually happening. He was going to plead guilty, admit what he'd done, face consequences. The courtroom was more crowded this time. The other victims were there, all 7 women he'd recorded without consent. We'd met briefly before the hearing, formed an impromptu support group of people bound by shared violation. Seeing them there, standing together, made me feel less alone. His family was conspicuously smaller. His father and brother were there, but not his mother. His brother told me later she couldn't face it, couldn't watch her son admit to what he'd done. His sister had sent a statement to be read by the prosecutor but didn't attend in person. He stood when the judge entered, looking diminished in his dress shirt and slacks. The confidence he'd always carried was gone, replaced by something that looked like resigned acceptance. His lawyer stood beside him, papers in hand. The judge asked if he understood the charges and the plea agreement. He said yes, asked if anyone had pressured or coerced him into accepting the deal. He said no. Asked if he was entering the plea voluntarily and with full understanding of the consequences. He said yes. Then came the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. The judge asked him to allocate, to describe in his own words what he'd done, to admit his crimes for the record. He took a shaky breath and began. Said he'd installed hidden cameras in his residence without my knowledge or consent, that he'd recorded intimate moments we'd shared, that he'd uploaded those videos to various platforms and profited from them, that he'd done this to multiple women over a period of 5 years. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading someone else's confession. He didn't look at me, didn't look at any of us. Just stared at his lawyer's briefcase while he cataloged his violations. The judge asked if he understood why these actions were criminal. He said yes. Asked if he understood the harm he'd caused. He said yes. She looked skeptical, but accepted his plea. Then it was time for victim impact statements. The prosecutor had worked with all 7 of us to prepare. 2 women chose not to give statements in person, had theirs read by the prosecutor instead. The rest of us spoke. I went last. Stood at that podium again and looked directly at him while I spoke. I wanted him to hear every word, to understand the destruction he'd caused. I described the betrayal of discovering the man I loved had been exploiting me, the humiliation of knowing strangers had viewed my most intimate moments, the paranoia that followed, the constant checking for cameras, the inability to trust anyone, the therapy, the nightmares, the panic attacks. I described how he'd stolen my sense of safety, my ability to be vulnerable, my faith in my own judgment, how every relationship would now carry the shadow of what he'd done. I told him I hoped the consequences followed him for the rest of his life, that every time someone found out what he'd done, he'd remember this moment, that he'd never be able to escape what he'd done to us. My voice didn't break this time. I was done crying over him. When all the statements were finished, the judge took a long moment before speaking. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence, all the statements, all the psychiatric evaluations, that she found his behavior calculated, predatory, and deeply harmful. She sentenced him to 5 years intensive probation. During that time, he'd be subject to random checks by probation officers, mandatory weekly therapy sessions specifically focused on sexual offending behaviors, and electronic monitoring. He was prohibited from possessing any recording devices except a basic cell phone with no camera. His internet usage would be monitored continuously. He had to register as a sex offender within 72 hours. That registration would be permanent and public. He'd have to notify neighbors. Employers couldn't live near schools or parks, would have to check in regularly with law enforcement. The criminal restitution was set at $25,000 to be paid within 2 years or face prison time. Each victim would receive their portion directly. If he violated probation in any way, he'd serve the suspended 3-year prison sentence. No appeals, no negotiations. The judge made it very clear this was his only chance. She also permanently extended the restraining orders for all victims. He could never contact any of us, directly or indirectly, for any reason. Violation would trigger immediate arrest and imprisonment. His lawyer asked for mercy, said his client had already suffered consequences through job loss and family estrangement. The judge said those were natural results of his choices, not mitigating factors. After sentencing, the civil settlement was formally entered. $50,000 paid over 3 years, starting immediately. A formal written apology that I could choose to keep private or make public. Agreement not to profit from the story in any way. His father pulled me aside afterward. Apologized for everything, for not acting sooner, for his wife's behavior. He was filing for divorce, he said. Couldn't stay married to someone who'd prioritized image over morality. His brother was moving in with him, helping him process everything. I thanked him for bringing me that laptop, for ultimately choosing to do the right thing. He said it was the least he could do, that he'd have to live with his failure to act sooner for the rest of his life. The other victims and I exchanged contact information, promised to stay in touch. We'd been through something horrible together, but at least we'd been heard. At least there'd been consequences. Walking out of that courthouse for the last time felt different than all the previous hearings. This time, it was truly done. He'd been convicted, sentenced, and ordered to pay. The legal battle was over. The healing, of course, would take much longer. But I'd won. We'd all won. Not the vindication of prison time, maybe, but the validation of his guilt being formally established, his crimes acknowledged. His life permanently altered by the consequences of his choices. That night, my friend cooked an elaborate meal, celebration and closure combined. The other women came over, and we toasted to survival, to justice, to moving forward. It wasn't closure exactly, but it was something. A definitive end to one chapter and the beginning of another. I could finally start thinking about what came next instead of constantly reliving what came before. And that, more than anything, felt like freedom. 3 months after the sentencing, I signed a lease on my own apartment. My friend had been wonderful, but I needed my own space, needed to prove to myself I could live independently without fear controlling every decision. The apartment was in a different neighborhood, one he'd never been to. It had a security system, a doorman, and was on the 8th floor. Specific choices that made me feel safer. Moving in felt like reclaiming autonomy I hadn't realized I'd lost. Therapy had become less frequent. We'd gone from twice a week to once a week, and recently down to every other week. My therapist said this was good progress, that I was developing healthy coping mechanisms and didn't need the intensive support anymore. The panic attacks that had once happened multiple times daily were down to maybe once or twice a week. I could go to the grocery store without checking every aisle for threats. I could sleep through most nights without nightmares. Small victories that felt enormous. Work had become manageable again. I'd returned to the office part-time, eventually going back full-time when I felt ready. My boss had been patient, never pushed, and when a promotion opportunity came up, he encouraged me to apply. I got it. The pay increase helped with therapy costs and gave me financial breathing room. The content removal specialist sent quarterly reports now instead of weekly. She'd successfully removed over 300 videos and images total. New ones occasionally surfaced on obscure platforms, but she was monitoring continuously. The battle wasn't over, but it was no longer consuming all my mental energy. I'd started a journal, something my therapist recommended. Writing about the experience, processing it in my own words, turned out to be incredibly therapeutic. Some days I wrote about the trauma. Other days I wrote about recovery, about small joys, about the life I was building. His first restitution payment arrived on time. $3,000 wired to my account. My portion of the criminal restitution. It felt strange, accepting money for what had happened, but it also felt like tangible acknowledgement of the harm caused. The civil settlement payments came monthly. The written apology had arrived weeks earlier. It was clearly lawyer-drafted, formal, and stilted, but seeing him admit in writing that he'd violated my privacy, caused harm, and accepted responsibility meant something. I chose to keep the apology private. Sharing it wouldn't change anything, and I didn't need public validation anymore. I knew what happened. The courts knew. That was enough. His brother checked in occasionally. He'd started his own therapy to process the family dysfunction, the guilt of not acting sooner, the complicated grief of losing his brother to his own actions. We'd grab coffee every few weeks, catch up on life. It was strange having a friendship with someone from that family, but it worked somehow. His sister reached out once, asking if we could talk. We met for lunch on a Saturday. She'd been in intensive therapy, processing her role in the family dynamics, learning to set boundaries with her parents who still refused to accept reality. She apologized again, more genuinely this time, and I found I could accept it. She told me her mother was in denial, insisted her son was the real victim, had surrounded herself with people who reinforced that narrative. Her father had completely cut ties with his ex-wife, was trying to rebuild relationships with his children. The family had fractured along fault lines that were probably always there, just hidden. I didn't feel responsible for that fracture. They'd made their choices, just like I'd made mine. One afternoon, I ran into him in a coffee shop. Or rather, I saw him and he saw me, and we both froze. He immediately turned around and left, as required by the restraining order. But in that brief moment of eye contact, I saw fear in his face. Fear of me, of what I represented, of the consequences that would follow him forever. I realized I wasn't scared anymore, wasn't angry. I just felt nothing. He was no longer the person who'd defined my trauma, just a stranger who'd made terrible choices and was living with the results. That felt like progress. I'd started painting again, something I'd loved before but had abandoned during the relationship. Hours would pass while I worked on a canvas, lost in color and texture, not thinking about cameras or violation or legal proceedings, just creating something beautiful from nothing. I joined a book club at the community center, made friends who knew nothing about what had happened, who just saw me as Riley, the woman who always brought excellent wine recommendations and had passionate opinions about contemporary fiction. The panic attacks continued to decrease, once a week, then once every 2 weeks. They still happened, usually triggered by something unexpected, a certain cologne, a teddy bear in a store window, a news article about revenge material. But I'd learned to ground myself, to breathe through them, to remind myself I was safe. My therapist asked me one session if I'd considered dating again. I said no, not yet. Maybe not for a long time. The idea of being vulnerable with someone new felt impossible. She said that was okay, that I'd know when and if I was ready, that there was no timeline for healing. 6 months post-sentencing, I realized I'd gone an entire week without thinking about him or the case. Just lived my life, went to work, saw friends, enjoyed hobbies. That week felt like a miracle. The trauma was still there. Some scars don't fade completely, but it no longer defined every moment, controlled every decision, colored every interaction. I was rebuilding a life I'd lost, piece by piece, day by day. And slowly, gradually, I was beginning to feel like myself again. The friendship with his brother evolved into something unexpectedly important. We'd meet for coffee every few weeks, sometimes more if either of us was struggling. It was strictly platonic, boundaries clearly established and respected. But there was something healing about maintaining that connection, proof that not everyone from that family was toxic, that some people chose truth over comfort. He'd cut ties with his mother entirely after she tried one last time to convince him I'd fabricated evidence. Said he couldn't have a relationship with someone so committed to denial. His father he saw occasionally when the old man needed support processing the divorce and family implosion. 8 months after everything exploded, his mother sent me an email. Not from a blocked number, just her regular address I'd somehow never gotten around to blocking. My finger hovered over delete, but something made me open it. It was different from her previous contact attempts. No manipulation, no request to drop charges or reconcile. Just an apology. She said she'd finally started therapy after her husband issued an ultimatum: get help or lose her entire family. That she was working through her enabling behaviors, her tendency to protect image over truth. She acknowledged the harm she'd caused through her harassment, her attempts to silence me, her prioritization of her son's comfort over my safety. Said she understood if I never forgave her, that she wasn't asking for forgiveness. Just wanted me to know she finally understood how wrong she'd been. I sat with that email for days before responding. My therapist said I wasn't obligated to respond at all, that I should only engage if it felt right for my healing. Eventually, I sent a brief reply acknowledging her message. Didn't offer forgiveness or reconciliation, just confirmed I'd received it and hoped her therapy was helpful. She didn't push for more, didn't try to start a dialogue, just sent a brief thank you for reading it. Sometimes accountability looks like accepting you won't get absolution. His sister asked if she could meet with me again. We'd been exchanging occasional texts, but hadn't seen each other in months. This time she wanted to talk about her own therapy journey, the progress she was making with family trauma. We met at the same restaurant as before. She looked better, healthier, more grounded. She told me about the family therapy she'd started with her father and brother, working through the dysfunction that had allowed her brother's behavior to flourish. About setting boundaries with her mother, limiting contact to only when her mother was actively working on herself. She asked about my healing, my therapy, how I was managing. It felt genuine, not intrusive. We talked about books we were reading, shows we were watching, normal things friends discuss. By the end of lunch, I realized this had become an actual friendship, not just shared trauma. His father reached out a month later. Asked if I'd be willing to have dinner with him and his brother, said he'd understand if I said no. Promised it wouldn't be about his son at all, just wanted to maintain some kind of connection to acknowledge the support his youngest son and I had given each other. I was hesitant but agreed. We met at a quiet restaurant. Talked about work and life and everything except the case. It was surprisingly normal. He asked about my new apartment, my promotion at work. His brother told a funny story about a disastrous first date. His father talked about his retirement plans. Toward the end of dinner, his father said he was proud of me for seeing the case through, for refusing to be intimidated or silenced. Said he wished he'd had my courage months earlier. I told him I understood family loyalty, even misplaced loyalty, and that his decision to ultimately do the right thing mattered. But here I am, surviving. More than surviving, actually. Living. Last month, I took a solo trip to the mountains. Just me, a rental car, and a week of hiking trails and quiet evenings with books by the fire. It was the first time I'd traveled alone since everything happened, the first time I'd truly felt comfortable in my own company without fear lurking in the background. I stood at the peak of a mountain on the third day, looking out at endless sky and trees, and felt something I hadn't felt in so long. Peace. Not the absence of trauma, but the presence of something stronger. Joy, maybe. Or at least the capacity for it. I took photos on that trip. Not compulsively. Not performing for cameras I feared might exist. Just capturing moments I wanted to remember. It felt revolutionary. Reclaiming photography as something I controlled. Something I chose. Back home, I'd been approached by a woman who ran an online community for survivors of privacy violations. She'd heard about my case through victim advocacy networks and asked if I'd be willing to volunteer as a peer mentor. People in early stages of reporting and recovery could connect with someone who'd been through it. I said yes. Started spending a few hours each week messaging with survivors, sharing resources, offering perspective from the other side of the acute crisis. It was hard sometimes, triggering occasionally, but overwhelmingly fulfilling. My trauma became something that could help others, that had purpose beyond just pain. Work continued to go well. The promotion had opened new opportunities, and I was genuinely enjoying the challenges. My coworkers had been respectful, never prying into why I'd needed so much time off or why I'd worked remotely for months. They just welcomed me back and treated me like nothing had changed. The painting had evolved into a serious hobby. I'd even sold a few pieces at a local gallery's community exhibition. Nothing life-changing, but the validation that I could create something beautiful, that others valued what I made, meant more than the money. I'd rejoined the book club after taking a few months off, made it to every meeting last quarter, actually engaged with the discussions instead of just going through motions. We were reading a memoir about resilience, and the author's description of rebuilding after trauma resonated deeply. One of the women from the book club had become a genuine friend. We'd get coffee before meetings, occasionally see movies together. She knew nothing about my past, and that was okay. I could be just Riley with her, not Riley who survived this traumatic thing. Both identities coexisted, but it was nice to have spaces where the trauma didn't define me. The panic attacks were rare now, maybe once or twice a month, usually tied to specific triggers I was learning to anticipate and manage. When they happened, I had tools, grounding techniques, breathing exercises, the ability to remind myself where I was and that I was safe. Therapy had gone down to once a month, just maintenance and check-ins. My therapist said I'd done remarkable work, that I should be proud of the healing I'd accomplished. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, that setbacks were normal and didn't erase progress. Dating still felt impossible, and I'd made peace with that. Maybe someday I'd be ready to be vulnerable with someone new. Maybe I wouldn't. Either way was okay. My worth wasn't determined by relationship status, and I was learning to enjoy my own company, to build a life that felt full and purposeful without romance. His brother and I still met for coffee, though less frequently. He'd started dating someone recently, seemed happy. His sister had gotten engaged, was planning a wedding that notably didn't include her mother. His father had retired, was doing volunteer work with veterans programs. The family had reshaped itself around the absence, learning to function without the missing pieces. They were all in therapy, all working on themselves, all trying to build healthier patterns. I was glad for them, hoped they found peace. I'd heard through his brother that he was complying with probation requirements, attending therapy, working a job that would hire registered sex offenders. He'd relocated to avoid the stigma in his hometown. I didn't ask for details, didn't need them. His life was no longer connected to mine except through legal paperwork and monthly restitution payments. The content removal specialist sent her final report last week. She'd successfully removed every video and image she could find across all major platforms. Would continue monitoring quarterly for any new uploads, but considered the active removal phase complete. 374 items removed total. The number still made me feel sick, but at least they were gone. I'd been thinking about writing about my experience, maybe an article or blog post about navigating the legal system as a victim. My therapist thought it might be therapeutic. The peer mentoring had shown me there was a need for practical information, for someone to say, here's what it's actually like. Here's what helps. Here's what I wish I'd known. Maybe I'd write it. Maybe I wouldn't. Having the choice, the agency to decide, was what mattered. A year ago, I was in that motel room, shattered and terrified. unsure if I'd survive the weight of what I'd discovered. Now I'm here. Healed isn't quite the right word. Some things leave permanent scars. But whole, functional, moving forward. The trauma happened. It shaped me, changed me, taught me things I wish I didn't know. But it doesn't control my story anymore. I do. I'm Riley. I survived something terrible. And I'm building a life I'm proud of. One day at a time, one choice at a time. The future isn't about erasing the past. It's about not letting the past erase the future. And for now, that's enough.